Welcome, everybody, to LOL, where the left laughs out loud and critiques itself and keeps itself from crying. And that's why we do it. We laugh out loud for this whole situation because it is funny. I am your host, Craig Postler Jardula, the captain. Along with me today, of course, my co-host, the professor himself, Jeremy Kuzmarov, is here. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, he is a professor at Tulsa Community College, but he's also an author of many books, many great articles. His newest book, Warmonger, a story about the Clintons. You got to go pick it up. Professor, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Great to have you here. Let's just jump into this. The professor brought this guest along. He thought it would be a great show, and I agreed. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't heard about Dr. Andrew Wakefield, you need to hear about him. You can go watch his movie. It's a documentary, and, disclosure over here, I love documentaries, but this is great. So much what we experienced during the COVID 1984 situation happened beforehand. The term was made that, they sharpened their knives on Dr. Wakefield before the whole COVID situation. And then as we experienced this whole situation, this global pandemic, so many things came to fruition. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Andrew Wakefield is with us today.
Craig, hi. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you too, Dr. Wakefield. Thank you so much. I'm going to get the ball rolling. The name of the movie, the documentary, what's the name of the movie again? Let me let you explain what it is real quickly, please.
The current movie, Craig, or ones that I've made?
The first one we talked about, which really explains who you are, because I want the audience to get a sense of who Dr. Wakefield is. Please.
Okay. This is a protocol. Sorry. The Pathological Optimist was a film that was made about my experience. It's not actually a film. I was a subject of the film. I didn't make the film, but it was something that I really didn't want to be involved in. I didn't want to be involved in a film about me, and it wasn't just a false sense of modesty. The issue was about something very different. It was about something much bigger. It was about damage being done to children in the name of industry profits and government policy, which was wrong. And I got involved in this 30 years ago, and that has been the sort of my career trajectory has been defined by taking a stance against unsafe vaccines for children. And my career has taken some interesting turns as a consequence of that. But I was convinced to make the film when we had a court case. We set out to sue the people who'd accused me of fraud, essentially scientific fraud. And that was the British Medical Journal and a journalist originally employed by the Murdoch group, Rupert Murdoch, and his son James Murdoch, who was on the board of GlaxoSmithKline, which was, Europe's biggest manufacturer of the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. When that happened, when that court case was anticipated, when we'd filed to sue them in the state of Texas, then there was a story. That was now a story, the beginning, the middle, the end. What was going to be the outcome of this court case? Because there we were prepared to put everything out in public. Anyone could scrutinize all the evidence and say, yes, Wakefield was a fraud, or no, he wasn't. They have lied about him in order to permanently damage any chance that he has of demonstrating that there is the link between vaccines. And now this comes to a point that you raised earlier: is the judiciary conflicted? Is it in itself fraudulent? And we filed a case in the state of Texas, and that was due to be followed by these documentarians to its natural conclusion. And what happened was that despite all legal precedent that was in our favor, that we had the right to sue these people in the state of Texas because the British Medical Journal profits from the state of Texas. It sells its journal to Texas medical schools and doctors, for example, that the judge ruled, the appeal court ruled against us. And they ruled against us against, as I say, all legal precedent. They did not want this case to go forward. They did not want it to be exposed that I was the subject of a fraud committed by the journalist and by the British Medical Journal. And they knew they'd lost. I mean, in deposition, it became quite clear that they had lost the case, but we were not allowed to proceed. So the case was never heard on its merits. It was dismissed by the Court of Appeals on the lack of jurisdiction, which was an entirely false matter. And I believe someone from very high up put pressure on those appellate judges to come to that conclusion. That is my sincere belief. And so, yes, in answer to the question you raised before we came on air, I do believe there is a very compromised legal system in this country.
Yeah, that was the question I asked you. Do you think the courts are a compromised institution? Because the title itself, the pathological optimist, like you keep returning to the courts and you're like, this time we're going to get it straight. The evidence is there. It's in our favor. You know what I'm saying? It's only logical. But my question right now is, because for those who are listening right now, the story unfolds is that in 1998, Dr. Andrew Wakefield put out an article in The Lancet, right? And then in 2004, almost 6 years later, the hit piece came out, right? So I think that, all of a sudden now we see to me, this movie wasn't about autism. This movie wasn't even about vaccines. It was about the use of smear tactics to push propaganda by the stenographers of the ruling class to achieve a certain narrative to protect their invested interest. And that's what we saw during COVID. Would you agree, doctor, or disagree in that assessment right there, that that's what this is all about? They're protecting their interest. So they do all these things. They kill the messenger. I mean, to me, it only seems logical. And in your article, you were putting out there that it wasn't black or white. You said we need to look into this more. We need to open up the books. We need to do more research over here. It wasn't even cut and dry. But even that, they went after there because it affected their bottom line. True or false, doctor?
Yeah. When you challenge pharmaceutical industry stock price, when you challenge their bottom line, and when you challenge at the same time you challenge government policy on vaccines, for example, there's no price you will not pay. And their concern, and I say this with an abundance of evidence, their concern is for preservation of public confidence in them, in the policymakers. It's not it's not even a question of whether the vaccine is right or wrong. It's a question of whether they can maintain public confidence in their decision making. Because if they can't do that, and they can't, and they haven't, then we're going to see what we've seen in the wake of COVID policy and COVID vaccination. Public confidence in these people is at an all-time low. Their interest is in protecting the vaccine program, not protecting the children. And that is a disgrace.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you pointed out in the movie, and I know Professor Kuzmarov, I'll let you jump in there, but I have so many good questions. I'm like a kid in the candy store. This movie was amazing because I think that when you see this movie, you actually change your way of thinking, right? So you mentioned the whole vaccine program. It's not really built on a positive, like, hey, this is really going to be helpful for you. This is something that needed. Take a look at the science itself. It's more of a coming from a negative perspective. Like, if you don't get in line, if you don't get your kids vaccinated, they can't go to school. There's something wrong with that whole system, and we need to really change our thinking. The public really needs to change our thinking, because when you see statistics like it used to be 98% of the people used to take the MMR, and then after Dr. Wakefield's information, and he's Dr. Evil, he's the mad scientist out there, it shrinks down to 80%. It makes me think for a second, oh, that's 80%. That's still a majority part of the population. And why is that number that way? It's because if you don't play along, you get thrown in the penalty box. What do you have to say to that, Dr. Wakefield?
Well, I think that let's put it this way. If vaccines were truly safe and effective, you would not need coercive policies to get people to take them or give them to have their children take them. You would be able to do so based in a public confidence in the efficacy and safety of the vaccines. But when you have to threaten parents, when you have to introduce legal mandates that they will not attend public or private school without being fully vaccinated, when you start to threaten to take children away from their parents because they will not, for various medical or religious or philosophical reasons, comply with a mandate. And believe me, mandates are anathema to medical practice. They are completely contrary to the rules of engagement with patients. You cannot force people into a medical procedure. It has to be done with fully informed consent, voluntary consent. And that has not happened. And when you reach a situation like that, where you have to be coercive, you have to force them by dint of litigation or whatever it is, then you have failed. You have failed very, very badly. And that is a road to nowhere. Ultimately, the whole system will collapse, particularly when you lie to parents, when you have to lie to them and say these vaccines are safe and effective, as is the case in my new movie, when we know they're not. And to say that a vaccine is safe, let's just be very clear about this. When you take a pharmaceutical agent, not a vaccine, a pharmaceutical drug, that has been through years of safety testing through the FDA to establish its safety and efficacy. That means a placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial that is long-term, comparing those who receive the drug and those who do not receive the drug. That does not apply to vaccines because they are classified differently as biologics. You would think that if you're going to give these to every healthy child in the country, then they would have to go through more rigorous testing than, for example, an anti-cancer drug for patients in stage 4 cancer, but they don't. The bar is set much lower for vaccines. They don't and have never, none of the vaccines on the childhood schedule have ever been through a placebo-controlled, randomized, long-term clinical trial. Therefore, you cannot designate them as safe. You can't. It is false. And to claim that they're safe is deceiving the public.
One last question, and I'll hand it over to you, Professor Kuzmarov. Dr. Wakefield, I'm kind of curious. What made you go down this avenue to look further into this over here? Because I think I already know the answer to the question, but I think it's important to point out that, from your last statement you just made right now and what we experienced during COVID. In other words, I think there was a lot of people out there, and this is why a lot of us were excited about RFK at one point, because he was pointing it out. He showed us that the whole process of why the drug companies tied to law, why they are trying to make them approved for children, because then it provides them protection for adults. It's almost like qualified immunity of sorts. But I want to know, and maybe you can lend a little credence to that too, but I also want to know, what made you look in this area and go down this road? Whatever kind of moved you to the point where you wrote that article in The Lancet?
Well, let's come back to the fundamental rules of clinical medicine, the way I was trained. And this is mainstream medicine. What's practiced now is not mainstream medicine. Mainstream medicine is where you listen to the patient, or in this case, the patient's parents. And you invest your trust in what they're saying because they're coming to you and telling you the story of what actually happened. And this is how medicine begins, how you begin to understand the emergence of new disease syndromes, is you listen. We've lost the ability to listen in many cases in medicine. And that is tragic. And when you listen to the parents, which is what I did, they came to me and said, Dr. Wakefield, my child was absolutely fine. They had an MMR vaccine. They lost all their ability to communicate. They lost speech and language, interaction with their siblings, and they ultimately had a diagnosis of autism. And I said, I know nothing about autism. I'm a gastroenterologist. How can I possibly help you? And they said, my child has intractable gastrointestinal problems, failure to thrive, pain, suffering, wasting away, abdominal bloating, constipation, diarrhea. And the doctors and nurses have said, that's just part of autism. Put them in a home, forget about them, move on. I mean, this is the tragedy that we faced. And they said, Dr. Wakefield, the other thing about this is there is an epidemic of this particular type of regressive autism. We're seeing it. So when I was at medical school, 1 in 10,000 children, never even read about it. now approaching 1 in 20 children in developed countries. Absolutely staggering rates. And so when they say my child regressed in the face of a vaccine, you have to take that very, very seriously. Why? Because when we scoped these children and biopsied them, the parents were right. The children had an inflammatory bowel disease. And when we treated that disease as we would treat, say, Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, classic inflammatory bowel diseases, then not only did the bowel disease, the bowel symptoms get better, but the cognition got better, the autism got better. They started speaking, using words that they hadn't used for 5 years. It was fascinating. And this was really the beginning of the understanding of the gut-brain link, the gut-brain interaction. And so I thought naively at the time, well, this is the parents have been proven right. The medical profession was wrong. We need to pursue this. But immediately that we called into question the role of a vaccine, then the dean called me in and said, this will not be good for your career. It was an overt threat, and he was, I suppose, right in that respect. But the weight of the world came down, and this is just a matter of sort of historical postscript. It's not a feel sorry for Andy Wakefield story, but in those days before cancel culture, with which we're now so familiar, became obvious, before it was me against the governments of the world, the pharmaceutical industry, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was an imbalance, let's put it that way, in the battle. And just to conclude on that, for years this remained in a sort of in abeyance, and I was still talking to the CDC for some years, and they asked me, well, why do you think it is? If everybody gets the vaccine, only some people get autism. And I said, we believe it's the pattern of exposure. It's the way in which you're exposed, the age at which you're exposed may be a risk. The younger you get the vaccine, the greater the risk of this brain injury. And we're all familiar now, after COVID, with the age and risk. The older you are, the greater the risk with COVID. But this case, we thought it might be. And they went away and they tested that hypothesis, and they found it was exactly correct. The younger you got MMR, the greater the risk. And it was highly significant. And what did they do? Did they recall the vaccine? Did they tell parents to postpone it till an age when it was safer? No. They put all of the documents into a dumpster and tried to destroy them, and they published something completely different. And for 14 years, American children were put in harm's way of a permanent, serious neurological disorder. So there you have the system, the CDC protecting themselves and the program rather than the children. It's an absolute disgrace. Yeah. And we found out about this because William Thompson, the senior scientist, came forward and said, I can no longer live with the knowledge that we've done this. Here is the evidence. I kept it. And that was the basis of the film Vax, the whistleblower story from within the CDC, not my opinion or my producer's opinion, but the senior scientist who designed the study, collected the data, analyzed the data, kept the data and gave it to us, saying, we did this terrible thing. And yet he retires. They all retire on their pensions happily. There are no consequences, no accountability. It is a disgrace.
That's the problem too. There's never any consequences. And by judging by our Congress the other day, watching them with the Fauci hearings, seeing at least those on the Democratic side of the aisle, they seem like they're going to go hard in the paint to continue to protect what happened during COVID. But, you know, I got to tell you something, what I really love too as well, and it reminded me a lot about what Dr. Zelenko, who's no longer with us, when he had talked about why he had looked for a reason to help his patients. It was the circle of compassion. And I think that's very similar to what you're talking about. All these children, the mothers, they came to you and said, we have these issues, please. And that's what led us down the avenue to look at why we needed to take a look at these vaccines. I thought it was just important to point that out, Dr. Wakefield, because the way you were smeared, because they said it was about Dr. Wakefield trying to make money. That this is, you know, he was Dr. Evil. You had the haircut, right? So they were like, let's get Dr. Wakefield. He's trying to make some scatole over here and money and profit off this situation. by really twisting it. Please, Professor Kuzmarov, we have about 4 minutes left, and we'll get to the second section where you'll be able to ask the majority of the questions. Please.
Okay, well, yeah, we can address the new film Protocol 7. Well, I had a number of questions, but for the sake of time, well, two quick questions. I mean, one would be, I mean, your original position was that the mumps vaccine should be separated from the MMR, but yet they labeled you this seems to be a pervasive smear, anti-vax and conspiracy theorist. If you could briefly touch on that. And my second question would be, in the 26 years since the Lancet article, what is the state of research on, and how much more do we know as far as the connection with a vaccine and autism?
Sure. The answer to the first question is that when we were looking at the clinical histories of the hundreds of children we'd seen when I was back in London, it became apparent that none of them had regressed into this condition after the single vaccines. It is after they had the combination MMR. And then the question was, is there some kind of interaction between the viruses? They were being given in a way that nature had never seen them before. 3 viruses in one shot. Nature, for the entire history of man's evolution, had never seen them like this. Was there some idiosyncratic reaction that led to brain damage? And so I suggested at the time, don't stop vaccinating, but parents may wish to take the vaccine separately, measles, mumps, and rubella independently, spaced by perhaps a year. And I said that because at that time, the single vaccines were available both in the UK and the US. What happened as a consequence of me saying that is that the UK withdrew the importation license for MMR, for the single vaccine, sorry. So it was MMR or nothing. And in the US, it was Merck who withdrew the single vaccines availability. And so it was our way or the highway. The industry was making the decision. Not the regulators, the industry was making the decision. We are not going to give you the single vaccine. So again, parents had no choice. And I called the Department of Health and I said, why are you doing this? If you are sincere about protecting children from, say, measles, why are you removing the option of how parents might choose to do it? And the answer was, and I was staggered by this, if we allow parents the choice of how they vaccinate their children, it will destroy our MMR program. Clear proof that their interest was in protecting the program and not protecting children. And so that's really the answer to that question. And I've forgotten the second question.
Oh, well,
we have about a minute 45 seconds left.
Okay,
So.
in 26 years, there have been other studies that validate or go further, because you were attacked for just proposing new research. And I think now we do have more research, right, that indicate this connection you were hypothesizing.
Yes, indeed. And so firstly, we have that study that was destroyed by the CDC that's now part of a major documentary. And believe me, we call these people, these scientists out. We call them frauds at the CDC. And had there been one mistake, one miscalculation in that movie, we would have been sued to the moon and back again. There has not been a whisper, not a single whisper, because they know that it's true. And worse than that for them, they know that litigating against us would mean discovery, and what they've done is likely far worse than we have disclosed. So yes, I think that the evidence is very, very strong in favor of MMR being associated in some way. And then the other studies that have been done comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations, Bobby Kennedy and Brian Hooker have written a book about this.
Yeah.
Clearly show that this applies the worst rate of autism, ADD, ADHD, all of these conditions in children occur in those who have been vaccinated compared with those who've not been vaccinated.
All right, that's it. We're going to take a quick break, 3-minute break. We're going to be right back with our second part with Dr. Andrew Wakefield. I am Craig Pasta Jardula. This is LOL, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep itself from crying.